Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is David Leonhardt. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Just yesterday, The Atlantic published a splashy essay headlined, "How Democrats Lost Their Way on Immigration." Add it to the list of think pieces aimed at explaining how the host of Celebrity Apprentice once again defeated a conventional heavyweight Democratic politician. Now, of course, few explanations are as powerful as Joe Biden's immigration policy. Just last week, the New York Times published some significant data points about the surge since Biden's inauguration, which journalist David Leonhardt declared the, quote, largest in U.S. history, based on the numbers he reported. Quote, annual net migration, the number of people coming to the country minus the number leaving, averaged 2.4 million people from 2021 to 2023, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Total net migration during the Biden administration is likely to exceed 8 million people, Leonhardt wrote. That's a faster pace of arrivals than during any other period on the record, including the peak years of Ellis Island traffic, when millions of Europeans came to the United States. Even after taking into account today's larger U.S. population, the recent surge is the most rapid since at least 1850. Leonhardt also pointed out, quote, the numbers in the Times analysis include both legal and illegal immigration. About 60% of immigrants who have entered the country since 2021 have done so without legal authorization, according to a Goldman Sachs report based on government data. So that means what we all just lived through was more dramatic than the pace experienced during those iconic Ellis Island years we consider completely central to the American dream, to its lore, and even to our identity as Americans. David's report was so significant, it generated a news cycle of its own, including a critical editorial actually in the New York Post. Now, David is a really great journalist to speak on this issue, not only because he's covered it very closely for the Times in his morning newsletter and beyond, but also because he wrote a book called Ours Was the Shining Future, the story of the American dream, that came out fairly recently. So he knows the real story of the numbers and he reports just the facts. But because he's also thought very deeply about what all of this means, about class, about race, and just about everything else. So in the days since his report landed last week, David has addressed his critics on the left and the right, and we are very excited that he's here with us on Undercurrents today to flesh out some of those criticisms, talk about his experience reporting the piece, and zoom out to kind of that 30,000-foot view as Donald Trump prepares to take office once again. What did we just see? What could we be on the cusp of seeing with a new Trump administration? David's here to talk about all of those questions and more. So David Leonhardt of the New York Times, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here, Emily. Thanks for having me.
Maybe we just start with the nuts and bolts, basically, about this immigration reporting, which is just a fantastic piece of reporting that you published last week. Could you tell us how you got to the numbers that prove this is the, quote, largest immigration surge in U.S. history? Like, how do you arrive at that mathematically?
Absolutely. Thank you. So first of all, the estimates of how much immigration there has been recently that we put in the Times story come directly from the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan research arm of Congress that's long been staffed with top economists. It's currently run by Phil Swagel, who's a Republican. It was previously run by Doug Elmendorf, who's a Democrat, and Peter Orszag. And it really is seen as one of the most credible sources of information. It estimates recent immigration using a mix of surveys and administrative data, things like records from immigration courts. And to figure out how this tracked historically, we had to pair this data with the census data. When you hear about how many people came to the United States in the late 1800s or early 1900s, or for that matter, the 1980s, that comes from censuses. Once every 10 years, the census goes out and surveys the country. But it's particularly bad at capturing immigration in between 10-year censuses. If you think about it, immigrants, particularly immigrants who are here without legal authorization, might not want to respond to surveys. And the census uses some statistical techniques that I won't bore you with that basically assume the population is changing particularly rapidly. So if you assume the population isn't changing rapidly, you're going to miss rapid changes in the population. So we worked with government economists and people at places like Goldman Sachs and Oxford Economics, who've also looked at this, to pair the recent CBO data with the census data. And when you do that, you see that on net, 8 million, more than 8 million people entered the country, both legal and illegal immigration during the Biden administration. That is the fastest pace of immigration in US history, even faster than in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the foreign-born share of the population is now higher than it's ever been in recorded American history.
Well, and that's a point I wanted to ask you about. People may be surprised to learn this means that we all just kind of lived through something that was more dramatic than the Ellis Island years that we all sort of have iconic in our heads. Why was that? I mean, what made this wave different than some of those more iconic waves, the Ellis Island years in particular, that people are familiar with from school and, the history?
First of all, the original huge wave of immigration lasted for decades. And so if you think about it as kind of the overall size rather than the pace, that earlier wave was still larger overall. But if you think about it almost like how fast a car is moving, we got to a higher speed this time, even though they traveled more distance, because they had high immigration for decades and decades. And I think the question of how could it be that immigration was just so huge over the last few years, I think there are a few different things going on. One, the Biden administration really did loosen policy. And I know there are a lot of immigration advocates, particularly on the left, who say, no, no, it's sort of they don't put it this way, but what they're arguing is it's sort of a coincidence. Biden loosened policy, but that isn't really the reason why immigration fell. I think they're just wrong about that. And the way you can see that is that after Biden began tightening policy in late 2023 and then really tightened it in the middle of 2024, guess what happened? Sure enough, immigration plummeted. So one is the Biden administration's loosening. And if you look at the Democratic Party's 2020 platform on immigration, it really is the most pro-immigration platform that any major party seems ever to have adopted. It says virtually nothing about border enforcement or about deporting people who are in the country illegally and break the law. It is almost all about making it easier to enter the country, both through legal pathways, but also making it easier to enter the country for people who don't have legal permission. Then the second thing that I think made this time different is that it's just much easier to get around the world in 2024 than it was in 1874 or 1924. Think about airlines. Think about the growth of highways and the spread of cars. Think about social media. I mean, when my ancestors came here, and they arrived at different points in different periods, but one of my four grandparents was born in Prague, and he arrived in the United States in 1940. When he got here, he wasn't able to pick up his phone and do a FaceTime call with his relatives back in Europe and say, I made it and you should come too. And so, whether it's social media or transportation or information networks, there are just many ways in which it is easier to get around the world than it used to be, which makes it easier for people to get to the United States, to apply for asylum, and often to be able to remain for years while their case is heard, and sometimes forever.
Yeah, I want to actually get into that in a second. And before we do, though, I wanted to focus on the push factors, right? This push versus pull debate. We just talked about Biden revoking some of those pull factors and seeing that show up in the numbers pretty immediately, and I don't say pretty obviously, but from the left, there's this argument that this was COVID. The economies in certain countries were just very dramatically hurt by COVID in ways that sent people. There was more violence and all of that. So if we just take those arguments seriously, David, what things may have pushed people beyond just the polls? What were there any push factors that we should take seriously over the last half decade?
Absolutely. Both push and pull factors are important. And so the push factors that I think increased immigration in recent years include some of the ones that you just cited. So the end of the COVID pandemic, which sort of paused immigration for a while. So you can imagine maybe some of the people who would have tried to come to the United States in 2020 or 2021 never did. But then some of them who might have tried in 2020 and 2021 and couldn't might have then tried in 2022 or 23. So that's one of them. Obviously, the chaos in Venezuela, the chaos in Haiti, the war in Ukraine. Those are all push factors that contribute to it, and push factors are important. At some point, climate migration may become a really big deal. It isn't yet a major cause of migration to the United States, but it's not zero, and it could become much bigger. I think one of the ways to think a little bit about the balance between push and pull factors is um, if you look at the biggest measures of human misery around the world, they almost all look better than they did 20 or 50 or 100 years ago. Global poverty, including in Latin America, which is obviously a huge source of migration to the United States, has plummeted. It's fallen really far. Deaths from war and violence ticked up somewhat in the last few years for obvious reasons. Ukraine, Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, the Sudan, relative to 10 years ago. But still, deaths from war and violence are much, much lower than they were for most of modern history and nearly all of human history. As Steven Pinker pointed out in his book about how life is better in many ways. And so it just kind of doesn't pass the most basic logical level that the main reasons we would have more immigration are overwhelmingly the push factors, because that would suggest that the world is a much more miserable place than it was 20 or 30 years ago. I don't want to dismiss the very real misery that does cause people to cross borders, but let's remember we have had coups and dictatorships and civil wars in Latin America. We had the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted for a decade. We've had horrible tragedies in Eastern Europe and in Africa in living memory, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, elsewhere. And yet, during those periods, we didn't see immigration reach the levels that it has recently, both to the United States, and if you look over the full 21st century, to Europe as well. So it has to be other things going on. And I think those other things are a mix of kind of technological progress like transportation and the internet that makes it easier for people to migrate, and what had been just increased openness in both the United States and Europe toward accepting immigration relative to the past.
Yeah, and just anecdotally, I remember a couple of years ago being in Reynosa and talking to some Haitians who had gathered on the Mexican side of the border, and they had come from middle-class lives in Chile and Argentina and other places, but they knew they could make more money in the United States, and they could probably hang around Reynosa long enough to, at some point, get across if there was a court decision. There's just the pull of the American dream, which you wrote a book about, is still so very, very real, David, for a lot of people south of our border.
I think that's a really important point. So for individual immigrants, it is often, usually, a highly rational decision to want to come to this country. And the research out there suggests, we don't have research about people who've come in the last few years yet, but if you look at the people who've come to this country in the past several decades, they're doing phenomenally well. Despite the lies, I want to be blunt about this, the lies that people sometimes tell about immigrants, lies that tend to come from the political right. I've talked about some ways in which I think the political left are missing this, but there are a lot of lies about immigrants, about them being predisposed to commit crime, which just isn't true. Immigrants commit crime at a lower rate than native-born Americans. Immigrants in recent decades have done very well in this country. They are climbing the economic ladder, they are assimilating, they are intermarrying, they are learning English at rates that look a lot like the rates of the Italians and the Irish and the Jews of earlier decades and of the 19th century. And so it is often very rational for immigrants to want to come to this country. And immigration, of course, is an incredible strength of the United States. But we can't admit anybody or even a meaningful percentage of the many people in the world who would like to move here and would enjoy a better life if they came here. We have to have a border. We have to be a nation of laws. And I think that is part of what has broken down over the last few years. And it's part of what we saw American voters rebel against in this election. It's not just that Donald Trump won, it's that the Democrats who won tough races sounded quite hawkish on immigration. People like Ruben Gallego in Arizona, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan. The Democrats who won tough races made it very clear that they believed that Joe Biden's border policy had been a mistake.
And that is a really interesting and important point. I want to ask what we know about who is here that claimed asylum or who is here that sort of crossed illegally, went to a sanctuary city, and maybe disappeared into the shadows. Do we have a clear breakdown of how many people are actually staying and what different paths they're using to stay? Or are we supposed to sort of be content with this very good reporting, the numbers themselves that show a very dramatic increase, but we kind of don't understand how everybody is getting along? I mean, what do we know about that?
There's a lot we don't know for I guess some obvious reasons. Um, the economists at Goldman Sachs have analyzed the government data, and they estimate that slightly more than 60% of the net immigration, so that's the people who've entered minus the people who've left, 60% plus of the net immigration during the Biden years have been people who've entered the country without authorization. So you basically, you're in rough terms, it's something like 5 million people who've entered illegally, 3 million people who've entered legally, or I should say entered without legal authorization. Sometimes they're still going through a process. But yeah, so in the old days, the kind of classic immigration case was someone sneaking over the border. More recently, it's someone arrives at the border, steps into the United States, and says they need asylum. Obviously, it's a really diverse set of people coming for different reasons, so I don't want to oversimplify it, but if we just think about what a main form of it is, it's that you come here, you say, I need political asylum. Now, the issue is some number of the people claiming this really do have reasons to fear being imprisoned or violence back home for their political beliefs. Many, many, many do not. And they are coming here for economic reasons, which again, on an individual basis is understandable. We just can't admit all the people that want to come here for economic reasons, or can is maybe the wrong word. The American people very clearly do not want that, and our laws do not allow that. But what happens is that people then enter the country and they kind of enter this incredibly backlogged immigration system. It can be years and years and years for their case to be heard. And then sometimes some of them do become someone who disappears into the shadows. They're denied legal approval to stay, but they stay anyway. Or maybe they get legal approval to stay. So there are many, many paths that people end up following. But it is not an orderly process. And when Americans look at this situation and say, I want something that feels like it makes more sense, in which people wait in line, in which there's an orderly process, in which the rule of law holds, that's not really what we have.
Right. And that's a really important point. It also is helpful understanding what these quote unquote mass deportations might look like under the incoming Trump administration, because so many of people in this latest wave actually came legally. They may have stretched their asylum claim as long as they weren't fraudulently claiming their quote credible fear, which is the asylum standard. As long as they weren't fraudulently making claims and they were coached to say things that may just have been stretches of the truth, whatever it was, they're probably here on a perfectly legal basis. So I guess, David, I'm curious what you think some of those paths. I mean, there are a lot of people who cross the border illegally as well, but what could this look like based on what we know about how people are staying?
I mean, it's really hard. There's such a wide variety of situations that the Times has a story today, a really heartrending story about a dreamer, a guy. His mother came for work, and he's lived his whole life here. Doesn't really even speak Spanish, and he's now married and he's got kids, and he's of course incredibly fearful about the idea of being deported. And I think those are the kind of stories and people who will really test whether the public actually wants the kind of deportations that Donald Trump is calling for. Um, I think then, on the other hand, I think the cases that are at least less sympathetic, I'll let others judge whether they are still sympathetic or not sympathetic. But if you come here and you request asylum, and it takes a few years for the courts to judge your claim, which is normal, and then they judge that you don't have a claim. On the one hand, you've been here for a few years and you've probably established some ties. On the other hand, we don't really have a functional immigration system if people can come here, claim asylum, we then decide that they don't qualify for it, and we are unwilling to deport them. That is a system in which we really are inviting people to come here, even if they don't qualify for a legal stay in this country. And I think, I would hope at least, everyone could agree that a system that made decisions more quickly would feel more just. To me, if someone comes to this country and it takes them a few months to get a decision, and then we say, no, you don't have legal permission to stay here, and that person is deported, that feels fundamentally more fair to everyone than a system where someone comes here for years, we then deny them, and then either they have to leave after having been here for years, or they disappear into the shadows and they live here illegally for the rest of their lives.
Now, your reporting was everywhere last week, and I wanted to ask a little bit of what you heard from the left and what you heard from the right. You've been very, I think, admirably, transparently addressing some of the points that have been raised just over the course of the last week on Twitter. But basically, if we start with the left, what has the response been? Has it surprised you in any way? Has it been surprisingly good, surprisingly, still head in the sand? What have you heard?
It didn't surprise me. I've been writing about this enough now that I've heard it. I think and you should have someone on the left to describe on the show to describe their views, because I'm worried I won't do it, to give it the best hearing I could, but I'll try. I think a lot of people on the left basically make the following argument. Donald Trump's immigration policies in his first term were cruel, they were inhumane, they separated families. A lot of these points are true, right? He said racist things about immigrants. And Joe Biden, simply as a matter of decency, had to repeal those laws. And so Biden did so. And then they say the huge surge of immigration that followed Biden's loosening the law was mostly unrelated to Biden's loosening of the law. It was about Venezuela. It was about the end of COVID. And so, yes, Biden loosened policy, and yes, immigration surged, but one didn't cause the other. I disagree with that, as we've talked about. I disagree with it because as bad as the situation in Venezuela has been, it isn't some uniquely bad situation. We've had horrible situations before, again, in memory, in Chile, in Argentina, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in parts of Mexico. They haven't led to the kind of immigration we've seen in the last few years. And then again, Biden starts to crack down by working with the Mexican government in late 2023. Almost as soon as he does, immigration starts to fall. And then he really cracks down in the summer of 2024, and it falls even further. And so and it began to rise almost as soon as he takes office. So the kind of argument from the left that Biden did this, he was right to do it, and the massive immigration surge that followed was a coincidence, I just don't buy.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. From the right, and I'll just sort of rebut some of my peers on the right quickly and say the New York Times reporting side has done fantastic work on immigration over the last several years. Some of the most heart-wrenching investigations into lost children came from the New York Times. I think the first real splashy investigation or thorough investigation came from the Times. Really important stuff. So I imagine you've heard a lot of that from the right in the last 10 days or I guess week. Why wasn't this before the election? I know you did a lot of reporting before the election. I'm just sort of guessing that's a little bit of what you heard, but tell us more about what you've heard from conservatives.
That's right. I mean, first of all, I want to be clear. I don't want to sound like a complainer here. We've gotten a lot of great feedback. The people who say, thank you for doing this story, you help us understand it in a way that I hadn't seen before. We've heard that from conservatives. We've heard it from liberals. We've heard it from people whose politics I don't know. It's just more interesting to talk about the criticisms that people had, right? And so I don't by any means sound bedraggled. I think, yes, the kind of the loud criticism from the right, including an editorial in the New York Post. I should say, by the way, that I'm a New Yorker. I grew up reading not only the New York Times, but also the New York Post. And
People.
so, yes, an editorial in the New York Post said that, the New York Times hid this news until after the election. Look, this took a lot of time to get these numbers together. And if we hadn't been writing about the massive immigration surge under President Biden before the election, that might be a more understandable criticism. But The Daily, our massive podcast, did a nearly hour-long episode on the immigration surge in the weeks before the election. The Morning, the newsletter that I run, that is another one of the Times' largest platform, has done multiple pieces on immigration. In March of 2021, we ran a morning. The headline, if I have all the words right, was "The Democrats' Immigration Problem," and it said they no longer had a coherent policy on immigration. We repeatedly talked about this huge increase in migration under Biden. My colleagues on the national desk and the Metro desk have done stories from Chicago, from Denver, from New York, from the border in Texas about how big this surge has been and how it has strained social services. So, on the question of whether the New York Times has paid a lot of attention to the migrant surge, if the left wants to complain we've paid too much attention to it, that is a criticism I would listen to. I disagree with it. I think it's a huge, huge story, but we've paid a lot of attention to it.
Now, outside of the Times, I think there are much more fair criticisms of media coverage, and maybe this I would apply to Times opinion side too, but as you are somebody who's covered this closely and done really good reporting on it, were you ever frustrated by stories you saw in other, I guess, like mainstream outlets, maybe places, without, you don't have to name names, but even if we're just talking about the bulk of the coverage, like from the 30,000-foot view level, again, anecdotally, when I actually went into Mexico, I was surprised by what I wasn't hearing reported back from outlets that have tons of resources and lots of reporters that could be on the ground there, and just things that weren't even partisan I didn't see reported. Did you experience any of that, David?
I'll do it a little more broadly if that's okay, Emily. I mean, maybe not
Yeah, of
surprisingly,
course.
I think the Times news coverage has been excellent. I think our opinion coverage has been excellent, and I, probably don't want to do media criticism writ large. But let me do it. But let me take your question seriously and do it and talk about something broader, which is, as you mentioned, I wrote this book on the American dream. And one of the things that I talk about is how the Democratic Party really moved away from working class people. And I trace the history of this, and the book came out before Trump's 2024 election. The paperback's out now, and I trace the history from the 1960s up to the current moment. And I use in a few places this phrase of Thomas Piketty, the French economist, where he talks about the Brahmin left. And it's the idea of this emergence of a kind of elite, affluent, highly educated left that we see really across much of the West, in Western Europe, in the United States, in similar countries like Canada and Australia. And this Brahmin left is a version of the left that really differs from the old working class left. And it is absolutely fair to say that some of the attitudes of the Brahmin left we do see reflected in elite media. So I'm not denying the premise of your question at all. And I think one of the real mistakes that the Brahmin left, which certainly includes many progressives in the United States, think about college campuses, think about intellectuals, think about kind of people who staff Democratic think tanks or are activists, is they've argued that immigration is a win-win. They've argued that it's a free lunch. They've said immigration is great for our economy and it doesn't reduce the wages of working class people. And it's not a problem for housing if you live in a community where immigrants arrive. And it doesn't strain school resources or social services. And the fact is that members of the Brahmin left tend not to live in the communities where immigrants are arriving. Immigrants are arriving in places like Queens, New York, and the Bronx, New York. They're not arriving in the affluent suburbs of Long Island and Westchester County and New Jersey. And we can do the same thing for any major metro area. And so it is working class people who are on the front lines of the effects of immigration. And many working class Americans look at immigration and they say, whoa, this has like definitely some downsides. And I do think that a lot of the discussion of immigration from elite progressives has really talked down to Americans, including recent immigrants, people who are living on the border in Texas and who have been uncomfortable with this, and says, no, 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 you don't understand. This immigration is really great for you. And if you suggest otherwise, it's out of ignorance or bigotry. And I think that has been a tremendous mistake. We are a nation of immigrants. It is a huge strength of this country that immigrants want to move here. It is a huge strength that they do move here, but there have to be limits. And this kind of Brahmin leftism, in which people who don't actually experience the short-term effects of immigration lecture people who do and tell them that immigration is only great for them when that's not what they're experiencing in their lives, leads to a political backlash. In Europe, it has fed the rise of the far right, and in the United States, it was a gift to Donald Trump in the 2024 campaign.
You know, as I was thinking about your book, it occurred to me, I wonder, did the Biden administration underestimate the power of the American dream outside of America? Because I was talking to a very high profile person in the Democratic Party, a critic of the Democratic Party, but this was back in 2021. And, we were talking about the border, and this person just looked at me and said, but why would they want to come here? Here? They're like, why would you want to be poor in the United States of America? And they could all, give you 10 minutes of an answer on that. Any, migrant you talk to would happily answer that question and tell you exactly why. But I wonder if the Biden administration just underestimated how much people still love the idea of the American dream, revere the idea of the American dream, and want to pursue it, because we're very much mired in pessimism here. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, David. It's just a random thing that occurred to me.
I think it's exactly right, and I think it's wise, and it's not an exact frame that I've heard before. And so, I've talked about the Brahmin left. If you look at polling, the group of people who are least likely to say the United States is the greatest country in the world are highly educated people on the left part of the spectrum. Less educated people on the left and less and more educated people on the right and in the center are much more likely to say the United States is the greatest country in the world. And so if you sort of imagine the United States as a hellscape, or at least as a kind of a mostly unjust place, you might in fact underestimate the massive numbers of people who would want to move here. This is a great country. You and I are talking right now, and I've just said some really critical things about both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I'm not worried about anyone putting me in jail. It is an affluent country. It is a country with substantially better rights for religious minorities, for LGBT people, than many, many parts of the world. It is a place where climbing the economic ladder is easier for immigrants than it is in much of Europe. And so, yes, when we make it easier for people to come here, huge numbers of people want to come here. That's great. We just need to figure out a way to have a system in which it's an orderly process. We, as a democratic small d nation, decide how many people we're going to admit and what the process is. And then once we do admit them, we welcome those people. We welcome them as full Americans. We do not say that to be an American is something about your ethnicity or where your parents are from. To be an American is an idea, and it's about embracing this country. And when we get it right, it's just a phenomenal strength of our country.
Your fascinating book touches on this question of, even if we're thinking about Donald Trump, make America great again. The way he handled the American dream in this last campaign, I would say it was pretty similar to 2016 and culminated in the American Carnage inauguration speech. But at the same time, he's sort of positive and negative about the American dream simultaneously. And as somebody who's written a book about this and the class dynamics and all of that, David, what do you make of how Donald Trump is able to sort of ride both sides of the American dream fence in a way that at least worked with, 50% of the electorate?
Yeah, he's got this, he's done it at least once. He has this appearance where he says the American dream is dead, right? And which it's not. I mean, I think it's significantly challenged, and I think we need to do a lot to reinvigorate it, but it's not dead. And on the other hand, there is something clearly nationalistic and patriotic about Trump. So he's an incredibly difficult figure to try to figure out, in part because he sometimes will say diametrically opposed things. What I would say is, on a fundamental basis, there are huge numbers of people who really have been dealing with stagnation in their living standards in this country. One of the kind of, to me, the central divide, it's not the only divide, but the central divide is between Americans who have a four-year college degree, who make up a little more than a third of adults, and Americans who don't have a four-year college degree. Maybe they didn't go to any college, maybe they went to some and dropped out, maybe they have a technical degree. They make up a little bit more than 60% of adults. So they're the country's working class majority. And when you look at trends like income or wealth or life expectancy. You and I have talked about these issues before, Emily. So, to me, there's no sign of how much life has stagnated that is more depressing and clearer than life expectancy. In 1980, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. For the last 15 or 20 years, we've had the single worst life expectancy for a rich country. There's no one reason for that. It's a collection of many reasons: COVID, opioids, guns, traffic fatalities, deaths of despair, all these different things that have hit the working class a lot harder than people with college degrees. And I think in his own kind of animalistic way, his outer borough Queens way, Donald Trump either was a stopped clock who happened to get it right or understood this kind of anger among a lot of working class Americans in rural areas, but not just in rural areas, also in small cities, also in places in major metropolitan areas that are not the richer parts of them. And I think he really kind of emphasized that. And at first, he mostly won the support of white voters. But over the last 8 years, for a complicated mix of reasons, including just how far left the Democratic Party and the Brahmin left have moved on a set of issues like immigration, Trump won increasing votes also from working class voters of color, including particularly Latino and Asian voters, but also a small but noticeable percentage of Black working class voters. And so, in some ways, I think what Trump is doing is tapping into both the real frustration about how hard life is for many people in this country who don't have a four-year college degree, and then also benefiting from the kind of radicalization of the Democratic Party in response to Trump's first term on COVID, on immigration, on some gender issues, on several.
And last question, David, your book, again, which great Christmas gift. It's called Ours Was the Shining Future, the Story of the American Dream. You're talking about the story of the American dream and also what it means to people who grow up with these legendary stories of how they got here, how their family sacrificed and built from the ground up. And I just wonder if you could speak to a little bit how fairness plays into our popular concept of the American dream, because it's both looking back, but then looking forward speaks to why I think a lot of people have been surprised to see polling that shows Americans supportive of mass deportations. It's not necessarily categorically because of this deep-seated racism. A lot of it is just, my opinion, it comes from the sense of fairness. What's fair? I did the fair thing. My family did the fair thing. And David, you've thought more about this than I have. So what do you make of that?
I think fairness is an incredibly potent political force. I think it is often a more potent political force than pocketbook economics. And one of the laments of Democrats today is, why do those working class people vote against their own economic interests? I think it's a pretty paternalistic question, but even setting that aside, it also ignores the fact that huge numbers of affluent progressives vote against their short-term economic interests. I mean, you look at almost any rich town in America, Scarsdale, New York, the wealthy suburbs of Chicago, Martha's Vineyard, Aspen, Colorado. They all vote Democratic. They vote for higher taxes on themselves. And part of the reason they do is that they look at the Republican Party and they think it's pursuing a vision that is fundamentally wrong and unfair. And the flip has worked as well. I think a lot of working class people have looked at our system and they've said it's unfair. The immigration system is unfair, as you just laid out. People aren't waiting in line the way my relatives did, whether their relatives arrived 5 years ago or 50 years ago or 150 years ago. They're saying people are just coming. They look at things like our economy and they say it's unfair, which also explains why, while the working class in the United States is moderate to conservative on social issues, it's progressive on a lot of economic issues. Minimum wage increases pass as referenda in red states. Expansions of healthcare pass in red states. The idea of kind of cracking down on greedy corporations is quite popular, even among fairly conservative voters. And so I think part of what unites all this is people care very deeply about fairness. Not everyone has the same definition of fairness. None of us probably have a perfectly coherent or consistent definition of fairness, but most of us have a sense of what's fair. We're probably more right than we are wrong about what's fair. And when politicians and our government system violates that sense of fairness, people get really angry and they react to it. And I think that so far in the last few years, that's been a huge liability for Democrats. But Republicans are now in charge. They're in charge of the whole government starting on January 20th. Um, uh, and so if they don't run the country in a way that people consider fair, that potency of fairness is probably going to be a bigger weakness for Republicans over the next few years than of Democrats.
Gets to your point about the DACA kid in Rome, Georgia. He was no longer a kid anymore. How fair is that?
Yeah, no, it's exactly what you're saying. You look at his story, and it's hard to argue it's fair to deport him. At the same time, it's hard to look at the huge influx of immigration over the last 4 years, and it's hard to argue that's fair either. And so I think for most Americans, the fair outcome is somewhere in the middle.
It's so interesting. David Leonhardt, thank you for your reporting, and thank you for coming on and talk all about it.
Thanks for having me, Emily. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. We're having so much fun with the show. We appreciate everybody tuning in, and we're just grateful that you're here. If you want to subscribe on the channel, that helps a lot. If you subscribe wherever you download your podcasts, it's also very helpful. And of course, if you want to support the show, you can get a premium experience over at undercurrents.tv. There are paywalled episodes that we publish every week. So if you head over to undercurrents.tv, you will get even more undercurrents in your weekly routine. Why not? Like I said, we're having a lot of fun. We appreciate you staying tuned, and you're helping us support conversations like this one with David Leonhardt of the New York Times. So we will be back soon with more, and we have a lot of great holiday content coming up as well. So stay tuned. We'll be back soon.